And thank all you guys for coming. You fill up the hall nicely.
So we're going to talk a little bit today about George's comic book work, which a lot of you won't be familiar with. It's a very old...
Shame on you.
Yeah. It's an old passion of George. He's been a comic book geek, from the get-go. And so we'll look at, what's led him there and how it compares to, writing some of the long-form stuff.
I am actually the first comic book fan, I think. In 1964, Len Wein ran the first Comic-Con in New York City. In Greenwich Village in 1964, 30 people showed up. It's grown a little since then, as you know. 30 people showed up, and we met in one room on a Saturday in Greenwich Village. The guests of honor were fabulous Flo Steinberg and Steve Ditko. So
I think that was the last Ditko show,
yes,
right?
I think that was the last time Ditko came to a Comic-Con. We must have scared him very badly. But there were about 30 people, as I said, and I was the first one to show up. So my badge said #1. So I guess that makes me
He's the first comic
the
fan.
first
yeah.
comic fan. And now all of you, I guess, are my children. God help me.
So when you're doing something short form, like the stories we've adapted into the comics, what can you do in a short form story better than you can do in a long form story?
I don't tend to think of the forms as being that different for me. I mean, I know there are writers who do. The Science Fiction Writers of America has 3 categories for short fiction for its Nebula Awards. It has short story, novelette, and novella, and then novel, of course. And some writers make real distinctions between that. They'll tell you that the structure of a novelette is fundamentally different from the structure of a novella. Me, I just start writing a story, and then when it's over, I look at how many words it is and say, oh, look, I wrote a novella. And, sometimes I say, oh, look, I'm writing a 7-book gigantic series. Admittedly, the times where I say, oh, look, I wrote a novella, it usually takes me less time. Maybe a month, maybe 2, but whatever.
So why do you think science fiction and fantasy are important to us as human beings? What drives us to read it, and what drives you to write it?
Well, you write what you read, and I grew up reading this stuff. I can't answer for all the rest of you out there why you read this stuff. But I kind of understand why I do. I mean, I was born and raised in Bayonne, New Jersey, a blue-collar industrial city across New York Bay from New York City. But Bayonne was very much a self-contained city, despite its closeness to New York. People were born in Bayonne and lived all their lives in Bayonne and died in Bayonne, and they worked in Bayonne, and they went to school in Bayonne. And that was certainly true of my family, which had been in Bayonne on both sides for multiple generations. We didn't have much money. We lived in the federal housing projects down on First Street, and I went to a public grade school, Mary Jane Donahue School on 5th Street, and that was my world. My world was 5 blocks long because we never went anywhere. We didn't even own a car. And I think there was a hunger in me from a very early age to experience more than those 5 blocks contained. And when I discovered comic books at first, and then science fiction and fantasy books, they took me away from those 5 blocks. They took me out of Bayonne. They took me across the world and to other worlds and to other times and to other places, to Middle-earth and to Barsoom and, to fabulous cities like Metropolis and Gotham City, and then when Marvel came along, to this weird place, New York City, which I'd heard rumors of, but I didn't often get there except once a year, for the Radio City Music Hall Christmas show. That was the tradition in our family. So I think one of the things that fiction fulfills in all of us is vicarious experience. I mean, I wrote in one of the books, one of the Ice and Fire books, the reader lives the reader lives 1,000 lives before he dies. The man who does not read lives only one, and I think that's true. I have traveled the universe, and I've climbed mountains, and I dived the deepest sea, and I piloted ships to Mars, and I've fought monsters with my broadsword, and I've loved hundreds of beautiful women, and it's all through the wonders of fiction and imagination, and, well, except for the beautiful women part.
So, some of the science fiction early writers you enjoyed and got you hooked. Who do you consider some of the masters? Who do you consider the folks that every time you go back to look at their work, you're still impressed?
Well, for me, the prose writer who had the most profound effect on me was Robert A. Heinlein. I mean, I was reading comic books voraciously, but I didn't read books. You know, I'd learned to read in school, of course, and in my era, all of you are probably too young to remember this, but for kids of my era, you learned to read with these readers, as they were called, that were full of the adventures of Dick and Jane. Dick and Jane and their little sister Sally and their dog Spot. This was the dullest family that had ever lived on Earth, and I didn't see the charm of reading about Dick and Jane. I mean, boy, they were boring. But then someone gave me a Robert A. Heinlein book, Half Spacesuit Will Travel, Scribner's hardcover, and suddenly I was going to the moon and to Pluto and to the lesser Magellanic, you know, the lesser cloud thing.
Thankfully, with no Dick or Jane.
With no Dick or Jane, you know. Instead, I was with Pee-wee and the Mother Thing, and we were fighting the worm faces, and boy, I was hooked. I had an allowance of $1 a week, which at the time would buy me 10 comic books. And now I had to say, well, I want to buy more of these science fiction books, and they cost 35 cents. So that means I had to sacrifice 3.5 comic books. But I thought it was worthwhile, so I started buying.
Well, you're just silly.
I started buying paperback books off the spinner rack and discovered all sorts of writers. But for many years, Heinlein remained my favorite, and I would always go back to Heinlein and read things. The Puppet Masters, one of the scariest alien invasion books ever written. What became my favorite book for many years. Starship Troopers, his other juveniles, things like Star Beast and the Rolling Stones. But of course, I read many other writers too that I discovered during that period. Isaac Asimov and Jerry Saul, A. Van Vogt, who I always found was incomprehensible, but I kept thinking maybe I'm just not smart enough to understand what A. Van Vogt is on about. I finally got old enough to think, no, I'm smart enough. It's just his stories are incomprehensible. Brilliant, but incomprehensible. One of the writers I settled on, of course, from that day to this day is Jack Vance, who passed away last year, sadly. But I think Jack Vance was the greatest science fiction fantasy writer of his day, and he's a writer who was doing great work well into his 90s.
Wow.
And you know, I hope to emulate him. His every time a new Jack Vance book came out, I would drop everything I was doing and buy it and read it immediately. There's no unread Jack Vance books on my shelf.
So, all right, you're having to sacrifice some comics to buy these books. What were some of your favorite comics?
Well, I was there, and this will really establish how old I was there. I read a lot of comics in the 50s. You know, when I was young, I read all sorts of comics. I read the superhero comics, which were all coming pretty much from DC then, national periodical publications, as they were called. Superman and Batman, and then the early Julius Schwartz titles, the Silver Age Flash and Green Lantern and the Atom and all that. But of course, when I was younger, I was also reading other types of comics. Comics in those days were much more varied than you know, they became in subsequent decades. The superhero comics were there, but there were also a lot of war comics. There were Western comics,
romance,
you know,
even,
that you
yeah.
could read. There were romance comics. Yeah, those were for the girls, though. So I didn't want to touch them because I might get girl cooties. You had to be careful about that sort of stuff. But when I was a little kid, of course, I read like the Harvey comics of um, Baby Huey and Casper the Friendly Ghost and all that. And then I got too old and sophisticated for those. Um, uh, there were comic genres that are largely forgotten today. There were hot rod comics, which I read voraciously. I was a big reader of hot rods and racing cars because my family, as I said, was poor. We didn't own a car, so the fantasy of owning a car was very exciting to me, especially a hot rod or a racing car. So I bought all of those. And at a certain point, after I'd started reading the science fiction, I stopped buying comics. I decided I was now old and sophisticated, and so I wouldn't read comics anymore. So I stopped buying comics for maybe a year or two. And then one day I was at the spinner rack in the Kelly Parkway candy store where I got my stuff, and right next to it was the comic rack. And I noticed this weird-looking comic called The Fantastic Four, and it was issue number 4. But it looked sort of interesting. One of the guys on it was a monster, and yet they seemed to be like superheroes or something. And it was from some bullshit company that didn't even have a name. Just it said IND in middle in tiny print. I didn't know what it was, but I bought it, and so I was right there for the beginning of the Marvel Renaissance. So that was Fantastic Four number 4, and then I promptly went back and got the first 3. Well, eventually, not promptly. You couldn't get back issues in those days because they were on the sale and they were gone. Yeah, there were no comic stores. You bought them in candy stores and bodegas and from spinner racks. But that got me starting reading comics again, and just in the nick of time. So I was there a couple months later when Amazing Fantasy 15 came out with the Spider-Man character, who I kind of liked too. And at some point there, I wrote a letter to one of the comic fanzines to Fantastic Four, and it was published. And then my life changed forever, because in those days when they printed your letter, they printed your full address. And I started getting all this mail from other comic book readers across the country who were like junior high school kids like me, saying, "Oh, you like the Fantastic Four? I like the Fantastic Four. Look, here's a fanzine that I've done." And it was the birth of comics fandom. It was before the first Comic-Con, but there were all these fanzines that were printed in mimeograph machines. If they were really classy, most of the comic fanzines were printed by a process called Ditto, which involved a tray of gelatin and a crank, and they could make like 30 copies or something like that before it faded to illegibility. And actually, from copy like 5 onward, it was semi-illegible. But and it was fascinating though when I started writing letters to that, and some of them were many of them were analysis and discussion of what was happening in the Fantastic Four, the JLA. Some of them, though, were original comic stories of characters that the fans had made up themselves. And I read some of those, and there were some good ones in there, and there were a lot that were really, really bad, really kind of wretched and semi-literate. And I said the words that changed my life forever: even I can do better than that. And I did. I wrote some comic stories, and I sent them off to these fanzines, and they said, "Oh, this is good stuff." And they published them, and people wrote letters saying, "Hey, I like that story by George R. Martin initially, and then R.R., because it was right around the time that I was Catholic. I got a confirmation name, and that gave me my second middle initial. So my entry into comic fandom and my first publications and my second middle initial all came around the same time. And thus I was launched as an amateur comic book writer.
So, as you're writing, how do you see a difference between science fiction and fantasy?
I think the difference is insignificant. There are people who think it's a very important difference. There are particularly science fiction writers, and I've been part of the field now for many decades. There are science fiction writers who think that science fiction and fantasy are polar opposites, and almost always everybody who believes that science fiction is the more significant of the two genres. But I read both of them interchangeably as a kid. I read Robert E. Howard one day and Robert A. Heinlein the next day. I read H.P. Lovecraft and I read Isaac Asimov. It was all my father, who was a fan of westerns, didn't understand any of this stuff at all. None of this is real. What is this weird stuff that you're reading? Why do you have to read all this weird stuff? And that's was fine to me. It was all weird stuff: science fiction, fantasy, horror. And writers in those days moved easily from one to another. I mean, Robert A. Heinlein is identified with science fiction, but he did write several fantasies. Isaac Asimov wrote fantasies. Poul Anderson wrote fantasies, and some great fantasies too. H.P. Lovecraft wrote several stories that were published in Astounding Science Fiction and are definitely science fiction stories, even though they have horrific elements. So the genres all kind of blended together then. In today's publishing climate, they've really separated and people built walls between them, but I think it's a false distinction. They're all branches of romantic literature, i.e. imaginative literature, as opposed to the realistic stream in literature. And the only thing that differs is the furniture. Sometimes you have aliens and spaceships, sometimes you have dragons and castles. It doesn't matter. It's the story that matters. It's the characters that matter.
So your work is known for, having these great, strong characters that you usually tend to kill off. But what do you think makes...
I kill off the weak ones, too.
They all die. What do you think of that makes a strong, enabling character in science fiction?
Well, I don't think science fiction is any different from any other branch of literature in that regard. Character is still at the heart of everything. I mean, William Faulkner, when they gave him the Nobel Prize, gave a very famous acceptance speech. And he said that the only thing that matters, the only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself. And that's always been my mantra. I try to put that in all of my stories. There's a level of complexity in real human beings that you have to try to capture as a writer. We are all contradictions. We are all people who are capable of heroism one day and abominable behavior the next day. We can all be heroes, we can all be villains. Sometimes we are the same thing at the same time. So when I read or watch TV and I see the perfect hero or the absolutely black villain, I don't like that. And this is actually one thing. I can talk about Faulkner. I can talk about Faulkner all I want, but and it's very erudite of me. But the truth is, a lot of it goes back to Stan Lee and those early Marvel comics. I mean, the Fantastic Four. When I encountered the Fantastic Four in '61. It was such a revelation to me because they were nothing like the Justice League or the DC heroes that I was used to. I mean, especially in those early issues, the Fantastic Four had real conflicts. The Thing hated being the Thing, and there was a violent streak in him. When he fought with the Human Torch in like a story like Fantastic Four #4, it was a real fight. It wasn't friendly bickering between families like it became in later decades, where they're just guys who like to smart off to each other. They came to blows, and there was a rage in the Thing that was, directed at Reed Richards also for, not curing him and getting him into the situation in the first place. There was also, I didn't know at 13 years old, I couldn't quite tell what it was, but you look at those and there's a sexual tension in some of those early issues. It's clear that Ben Grimm also had the hots for Sue Storm.
Well, we all did. Come on.
Well, yeah. and when they brought in the Submariner, Sue was attracted to him, and it was like a genuine sexual triangle for a couple years. Would Sue pick Namor or Reed? And you didn't know how it would come out because Lee was so unpredictable. This is the kind of stuff, human stories, the human heart in conflict with itself. Spider-Man came along, and he was not the Flash or Green Lantern. He was not, hey, I'm going to be a hero. He was constantly, having self-doubts, and he was a great hero, but he still couldn't get laid, or and he lived with his aunt and uncle. It was just great stuff, and that kind of gray characters. The Marvel characters had a depth that the more traditional DC characters that I'd grown up with did not have, and that really got me addicted to this idea of gray characters. I was being interviewed earlier today by some guys from Marvel, and we were talking about the Avengers. I published a letter in the Avengers as well. I published a number of letters in the early Marvel Comics of the early days. And my letter in the Avengers was a letter of praise about the first issue that introduced Wonder Man.
Number 9, yeah.
And those of you who weren't there for Avengers number 9, this character Wonder Man comes along, and he's really powerful, and he comes along suddenly, and he joins the Avengers as this new hero and he's really a plant who's been set in to destroy the Avengers from within. But then when the crucial time comes, he can't bring himself to do it. So he revolts against his evil masters and dies heroically in the same issue that introduced him. I look back on that now from the distance, and I say, my God, the influence over my work is enormous. I mean, here's this gray, conflicted character. He seems to be a hero to the outside world, and even the Avengers accept him as a hero, but he's really a villain. But when he comes to the point where he's supposed to murder someone, he can't bring himself to do it, and then he pays the ultimate price for that and dies heroically. And I've been stealing from that ever since. It's great. Of course, then they ruined it by bringing him back, but, what the hell.
Marvel's never had a character they couldn't kill and bring back in like 12 months. I mean, they go through them all.
I think Uncle Ben, right? He's still dead.
I couldn't tell you. He's probably a clone. So
I think that's a rule of comic books, that no one but Uncle Ben and Batman's parents are really dead.
So with all the great characters you create and get invested in with these huge stories, do you ever feel personally upset when you decide to kill somebody off? Is there a sense of loss?
Yeah, there are. In some ways, these characters are more real to me than real people, because I know them better than real people. I've been writing Song of Ice and Fire since 1991. So even if I've been planning since 1992 to kill a character, when I finally get to the point where that character has to die, it's hard for me to pull the trigger or swing the sword, as the case may be. But, the story rules, and I do what I have to do. That doesn't mean I necessarily enjoy it for the most part. Now we're talking about major characters. I kill a lot of minor characters, too, and they're just sort of passing through.
They're fodder.
Even in the case of minor characters, I try to give them a little moment of life, a little something so that just not Spear Carrier number 7.
Red shirt.
Yeah, you should. Death is that's a pretty serious business, and I remember when I was on a TV show in the 80s called Beauty and the Beast. Some of you may remember. And Linda Hamilton was the star of that show, and after 2 seasons, she left the show. So the writers on that show had to make a decision: do we recast her part, or do we write her character out in some way? And of course, we decided it would be more dramatic to write her out, indeed to kill her, and then to bring on a new beauty to be Beauty and the Beast. And we did that. The network supported us in killing her, but they wanted us to get past it very quickly. We had a big fight with them because the next episode after Linda's character, Catherine Chandler, died, was Catherine's funeral, and we had all these characters mourning her and talking about her, and Vincent was inconsolable, and played by Ron Perlman, and her, even though she was dead, the next 12 episodes, our third season, was largely a search for her murderer and a search for vengeance and all that. All of this the network hated, and they said, look, the actress has left the show, you have to kill the character, we understand that, but people don't want to be sad, so don't have all this mourning stuff and this grief. Just, kill her, and he should get revenge in that same episode, and then we should go on to new adventures, and her name should never be mentioned again. And
so swept under the rug.
Get the new beauty in there quickly so it's fun to watch. And we had a huge fight about that, and I still think artistically, emotionally, we were right, because we said no, that cheapens the whole character. Death should matter. People have been following this character and loving this character for 2 years. She's died. We're going to build the whole show around it. We're going to show the grief, and we're going to show the mourning. Death should hurt, just like it does when your mother dies, or your father dies, or your best friend dies, or God preserve it doesn't happen, your child dies. When death happens to us in real life, it's a gut-wrenching event that makes us weep and makes us sad, and we can't easily shrug it aside and say, well, okay, Dad's dead,
yeah.
What's on television? The truth was, though, that in some ways the network may have been right, because our ratings after Linda's death fell off a cliff, and people clearly didn't want to. People were too saddened by the death and too affected by the death, and they didn't want to tune in every week to be sad. And I had some of that fear with Game of Thrones, because in first season when we killed Ned Stark, I really wondered about the next week. I said, okay, is this going to be the same thing here? Is our ratings
That was that. Oh, well.
going to fall off the cliff here? But thankfully they didn't. And I don't know if the modern audience is just more bloody than the audience of 1989, but maybe we are, or maybe we did it better. I don't know. But nonetheless, it still maintains my attitude. Death should not be an act break here. If you're going to kill a character, it should have an impact on the other characters. The loss of that character should be felt. I want my readers to feel emotions. That's what I think fiction is all about. If you want to make an intellectual argument, nonfiction is the perfect vehicle for that. But fiction is about emotion. I want you guys to read my books and to laugh and to cry. And, if it's a scary, horrific scene, I want you to be scared. I want you, if it's a scene where the character's in jeopardy, I want you to be afraid to turn the next page. I want you to be hungry at the feast scenes and aroused at the sex scenes, or whatever, as if you're experiencing the events on the page and not just reading about them in the comfort of your favorite reading chair. And not all the emotions can be good ones. Sometimes part of that vicarious experience is the darker emotions like grief and fear and anger. And I want to make you feel those too.
So,
thank you.
So you've spent a great deal of your life engaging with fans and being involved in fandom and, doing conventions. And even as your career has blown up to the unimaginable level it has, you're still dedicated to going out there and seeing the fans and spending time and giving all of us your time. Why has this always been so important to you?
I am a fan. I was the first fan, as I said, and with science fiction fandom, I went to my first Worldcon in 1971. My first Comic-Con was even before that. My first San Diego Comic-Con was in the 80s. There's always been a sense of coming home. I've made so many relationships over the years in fandom. Professional relationships with editors and publishers, but also friends that I've met at conventions. I met my wife at a convention. She said once the first time she attended a science fiction convention, it was like at last, my people, I have found you, and I feel part of that too, and always have. Um, so I go to a lot of conventions. I mean, people ask me, well, why do you go to? People understand why I come to Comic Con, San Diego. I mean, there are 150,000 people here. It's a gigantic opportunity like no other to promote your work, and it's very important professionally. HBO wants me here. Random House, my main publisher, wants me here. My other publishers like Avatar Press seem to want me here. So there's big promotion for that. But I also go to little 500-person conventions in Albuquerque and in North Carolina and in Fargo, North Dakota. And people say, well, why the hell are you going to Fargo, North Dakota for 500 people? And it's because, I have fun at these conventions, or at least I used to. I have to admit, there's a dark side to the popularity of the show, and it's that, in the last few years, I've become a celebrity, and that's not the bed of roses that it necessarily always is here, because it's sometimes hard to just relax and have a drink with friends at a hotel bar,
Sure.
or eat your dinner or something like that,
Or walk around Comic-Con.
or
Yeah.
walk around Comic-Con. Yeah, it does sadden me that I can't walk the floor anymore at Comic-Con, because I used to do that for years. I used to just wander around the floor, and one or two people would recognize me, and that would be fine, and I would sign their books or something. But now it's like one or two people per feet, so I can no longer, go and see what the new comics are and appreciate the booths, and I have to have security and all that. And I don't want to complain about that. It's something that most writers, of course, would give their left leg to have, and I do appreciate that. I appreciate all the support and affection, but it's certainly changed the way I experience these conventions,
Sure.
especially big ones like this. So that's another reason I go to little ones, because there's like fewer people.
If there's 500 people, you sign 500 autographs, you're done,
Yeah, I'm
right?
done. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the couple projects you've done for me that are out. We're just debuting here the number 1 of the series, In the House of the Worm. It's a short story that you wrote quite a while ago that we had
A
done.
novella.
A novella, yes. So tell me a little bit about that, or the time of your life when you were working on it.
Yeah, that was during the 80s. It was early 80s, I think I was. I was still living in Chicago at the time, and there was a editor in the field, Terry Carr, great editor. He did a series of original anthologies called Universe, and I'd met Terry at the very first science fiction convention I went to in 1971, and he really impressed me then. And Universe was a great series of books that really it was just the kind of science fiction that I really loved, and just the kind that I really wanted to write. So in those days, I was selling to Galaxy and to FNSF and to Analog, all of the magazines. But I wanted to sell to Universe as well, just to have that feather in my cap. And I wanted to sell to Terry because I knew he was an excellent editor. So I kept sending him stories that he kept rejecting. And finally, I wrote this one, In the House of the Worm, this novella, it's sort of set in a far, far future where the sun is largely going out, very influenced by Jack Vance, I think, and his Dying Earth series. And there's only a small remnant of humanity left, and they've retreated into this vast underground bunker. And it's a very decadent kind of society. They're eating worms and spiders and having meaningless sex, and there are all these tunnels below them that are lost in darkness. So it's a very kind of Baroque horror kind of feel to it. And I sent it to Terry Carr, and Terry Carr finally bought something of mine, which was a big thrill for me. But then he didn't put it in Universe. He had some other anthology, a one-off, that he decided it would be good for. So I never got to be in Universe. But I did sell a story to Terry Carr, and I was very pleased with that. And I remember when you wanted to buy it, I said, William, you do realize that half of the story takes place in absolute blackness. So you're just going to have 2 issues of completely black panels with word balloons. Boy, I wish I could see. But I think you found a way to solve that problem.
Yeah, it's just really, really dark coloring. Yeah.
But it's a novella I've always been pleased with, and I hope you guys are too. And we started doing the Avatar comic 137 years ago, uh, and we hired this artist from Brazil who drew one panel a year, I think, right?
Yes, exactly. So 137 years later, here we are.
No, you should tell him about the artist. You know more.
Yeah,
about that.
so Ivan Rodriguez is the artist. He worked for me actually on a series with Warren Ellis called Doctor Sleepless, and then those bastards at DC came and stole him, and he did a bunch of stuff for them: Legion of Superheroes, Justice League, and in the meantime was hunting and pecking away on in the House of the Worm because he committed to do it and wanted to do it, but then he had all these other gigs, and yes, it took an inordinately large amount of time, but it looks beautiful, and now it's all done, so we can actually put it out monthly. Issue 1's debuting here, so then subsequent months we'll have each of the other issues.
The adaptation was done by my friend John Joseph Miller, who is one of my Wildcard writers. For those who know my Wildcard series, a creator of Yeoman and Carnifex and numerous other heroes. And he should not be confused with John Jackson Miller or John J. Miller, who are just totally different people. But to his annoyance, I keep telling him, John, change your name. They keep confusing you with other people. But he did a fine job with the adaptation, and Mr. Rodriguez did very well with the art, and it's cool.
So when you see something like House of the Worm turned into comics, which of course you'd never really originally intended, and this also works for when you see your other material adapted into, say, TV shows. How does it feel experiencing the work in an entirely different, method of delivery like that? Is it just an out of body experience? Do you?
Well, it first of all, there's a little anxiety when you turn it over to someone else, because you don't know what you're going to get. You could get something beautiful and terrific, and you could get something really bad. It's like, you have your kid and you're taking him to school for the first time, and are you turning them over to, wonderful people who will teach him well, and are these a nest of child molesters who will sell him for medical experiments after they're done with him? You never quite know.
That's pretty much worst case scenario,
Yeah.
I think.
It is, yeah. But I think every parent probably fears that, and that's true whether you're selling a movie deal or a comic deal or anything else where you're turning over your work over to other people. But all you can do is, try to select the people well, and hope that it turns out for the best. I think in the best adaptation, they add something to it. Each of these mediums is different, and of course, with comic books, you have the wonderful dimensions of the art. So ideally, the best comic adaptations take a prose work and add images to it that not only bring it to life, but that add something, that images that in a way that the reader of the prose might never have seen or thought of.
Mm-hmm.
So that's exciting, but it never, for me, it never quite matches the original story. I mean, but I'm in a unique position, and obviously
Slightly biased.
and prejudice, yeah. But so I'll always prefer the original story. And in the case of something like Game of Thrones, as hugely popular as the show is, and I love the show and I love what they're doing with it, but for me, it's always great also that so many people, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people who have enjoyed the show have then gone on to buy my books and to read the original version of the story, which is larger and more detailed and more complex than the show can possibly do in its 10 hours. And the same is true of something in the House of the Worm.
Mm-hmm. So we're also finally collected the previous series we did, Skin Trade, which was again adapting one of your award-winning shorts. Now that's a horror project, and you're not known for doing tons of horror stuff. So tell us a little bit about.
Well, I have done some horror stuff, and I've done some hybrids. As I say, I don't see these firm distinctions. So, just like H.P. Lovecraft would weld science fiction with horror, I did that with stories like Sand Kings and Night Flyers, And I like the idea of taking two genres and melding them together and coming up with something halfway in between. In the case of Skin Trade, it's a horror story with a sort of noir private detective, hard-boiled private detective story. It's a private detective werewolf kind of story set in a decaying Midwestern city. That one was written in the late '80s. I think I was actually on Beauty and the Beast when I wrote it. So I spent 10 years in Hollywood, roughly, working on Twilight Zone, Beauty and the Beast, and then in development. Roughly from 1985 to 1995. But during all that period, I always wanted to keep my hand in with stories and books, because that was my roots. I didn't want to lose track of my roots. So I tried to do as many short stories as I could. I didn't have the time to write a novel, but I could do more, the occasional short story, and I launched Wildcard during that period. And I also wrote Skin Trade. There was a small press around back then called Dark Harvest, and they had a annual anthology series called Night Visions, which was a terrific idea. And each Night Visions featured 3 writers. Paul Michael, the guy who ran Dark Harvest, said, well, in every book I want a big name writer and a middleweight writer and a new writer, a new young writer. But of course, he didn't say it that way publicly. But we knew that was the design on it. And each of the 3 writers was asked to contribute 30,000 words of original horror fiction, and that's all we had to do. Now, you could take the 30,000 words. You could write 10 3,000-word stories, or 3 10,000-word novelettes, or in my case, 1 30,000-word novella. And when he asked me, I had edited one of these things, and now he did one of these annually. I had edited Night Visions 3, and now he was doing Night Visions 5, and he wanted me to be one of the writers in it. And the heavyweight in Night Visions 5 was this guy named Stephen King. So I would have been the middleweight, and I said, yeah, I really want to be in this book, because millions of people are going to buy it to read the Stephen King story, and then they discover my story too. But I was working on a TV show at the time, and I didn't really have any time. But I knew I had to get this done, so I blew the deadline. I blow deadlines all the time.
What?
It's nothing new. I've been doing it, but thankfully Paul took pity on me and gave me a little extra time to get it done. And I was working all week on Beauty and the Beast, and then I would stay in the office. I would come in on Saturday and Sunday and stay there all day and try to get the Skin Trade finished. And it was this werewolf story. I had done Fever Dream a few years earlier, which was my vampire thing. So I'd always wanted to do a werewolf thing to pattern with my vampire thing. And I had this great idea about this sexy young female private eye and a hypochondriac, asthmatic werewolf collection agent. And it wrote itself. I love those 2 characters. I love it. I always wanted to write more stories about the 2 of them, but I haven't had the chance. But it's still one of my favorite of my novellas.
So we've got, both these, the collection of Skin Trade and In the House of the Worm #1 at booth 2701, if anybody wants to pick one up after the panel.
And I've defaced most of them.
And yeah, they're all signed, actually, so...
So, you don't even have to stand in line to get my signature. You can just go over to his booth and get my illegible scroll. It's this one in silver here.
Yeah. So, I think to wrap it up, I'm certain in the crowd there's quite a few aspiring writers. What does it take to succeed? Any essential advice? Which I'm certain this is a question you get all the time, but...
Well, I have my best advice is on my website and frequently asked questions, but there's no secret. I mean, you have to write every day. The more you write, the better you'll get. You have to read widely. That's one thing that I try to hammer home, especially at things like a comic book convention or a science fiction convention, because the fans I've met, and this has been true for decades, many of the fans I meet read a lot, but they read very narrowly. They discover at a very early age they like superhero stories, and then they read nothing but superhero stories, or they like science fiction and they read that. That's fine, and I like superhero stories too, and I like science fiction and fantasy, but I also read mystery novels. I also read a lot of historical fiction. I also read literary fiction, and Raymond Chandler and F. Scott Fitzgerald and William Goldman and Dennis Lehane and people like that are marvelous writers. And the more you read, the more you see the techniques being used and what different people are doing, the more you learn. And so read widely, read voraciously, and try to write every day. And don't give up. That's another big part of it. I mean, there were a lot of writers who started the same time I did, or even later, who have vanished. And why have they vanished? They stopped writing, they gave up. I'm still here, and because I didn't give up. There were a couple points in my career I could have given up. Writing is not a career, by the way, for anyone who wants security. You have to be a bit of a gambler. It's a career of highs and lows, of ups and downs, and you can never really say, "Ooh, I've made it." I had that point, and I had with Fever Dream. I was a hot young writer in the 70s and the early 80s. I was winning awards, Hugo Awards and Nebula Awards. Every book I wrote got a bigger advance than the one before. I got great reviews, and I really thought I was hot shit. And then I wrote a novel called The Armageddon Rag, and suddenly my career was over because it sold so poorly. So there's always these reverses that will come and smack you in the face. Trends will change. You'll be the cutting edge, and then you'll be yesterday's news, and you have to reinvent yourself. It's a career for people who don't mind that. Who if you need security, if you need a steady paycheck, accounting I hear is very good.
In fact, almost anything that isn't writing.
Right, yeah. Anything that isn't, well, except maybe drawing. That was probably
yes.
That
Starving artists, starving writers.
be just as bad. So that's part of it. One of the questions to ask if you're an aspiring writer is, ask yourself, what if no one ever bought any of my work? What if I'm never going to sell a book or publish a book or a short story? Are you going to continue to write? And if the answer is yes, because I have to, then yeah, then you are a writer. And whether you'll sell or not, I can't know. But if there are stories in you that have to get out, you want to put them down on the paper, whether you ever get the affirmation of a contract or a book in your hand or being on the bestseller list, if you still have to tell your stories, then you're a writer. If you can give it up, then it probably would be an act of sanity to learn accounting or something like that. Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming out and spending time with us. Let's hear it for George R.R. Martin.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.